our viewers in the United States and all around the world, this is New Day. It is Monday, December 28th, 6 o'clock here in New York. Off. Jim Sciutto joins me. Great to have you here.
It's great to be here. We got so much news this week. And a little bit of happy news, maybe going into the new year.
I mean, often holidays are slow news weeks, not now.
No, badly.
Okay, so let's get right to it, because breaking overnight, President Trump signing into law a $900 billion package and government spending bill. But by signing it after 7 p.m., the president averted a government shutdown, but his late action will punish millions of unemployed Americans by letting their benefits lapse. For days, President Trump resisted signing the bill, then spent the holiday weekend golfing in Florida. The New York Post is blasting the president's efforts to overturn the election results with this scathing front page editorial, calling on the president to, quote, stop the insanity and declaring you lost.
When you've lost Rupert Murdoch, that's big news for this president. We are also following new developments out of Nashville, Tennessee. This morning, we are seeing just incredible video. There it is, of the very moment of that blast on Christmas morning. What a thing to see on the streets of the United States of America. Officials have now identified the man who they say detonated a bomb inside an RV parked downtown. There he is. And they are now focusing on his motivation, why he did. Our coverage with CNN's Boris Sanchez. He is live in West Palm Beach, Florida, where the president is still vacationing. It took him time, Boris, a lot of rounds of golf, but finally that signature last night.
Yeah, that's right, Jim. After several days of delays and numerous rants on Twitter, President Trump finally signing that relief bill. But his delay may have actually hurt many Americans who were already struggling. And now the president faces questions about what he actually won with this standoff. Many lawmakers wondering, what was the point?
A new coronavirus relief package has now been. President Trump finally signing the new relief bill, coupled with a new spending bill on Sunday night, narrowly avoiding a government shutdown. Congress passed the bill last week, and it was flown to Mar-a-Lago for the president to sign on Christmas Eve. But Trump refused, claiming the amount of money allotted for American aid was too low and objecting to some bill line items. While millions waited for Trump's decision, the president was seen golfing throughout the Christmas weekend.
Right now, we're at a point where people are left out in the dark. But to play this old switcheroo game, I don't get the point, unless it's just to create chaos and show power and be upset lost the election. Otherwise, I don't understand it.
On Saturday night, the president allowed nearly 12 million Americans' unemployment benefits to lapse under two different federal unemployment programs. By signing this current bill, the benefits are reinstating and extending until March. But since Trump did not sign the bill by Saturday's deadline, he will most likely not receive benefits for the last week of the year.
It points up his limitations as a president. He really doesn't pay much attention to the details of the legislation that he's working on or to the impact that it has on people, or he would have signed this in the first place.
The coronavirus relief bill totals over $900 billion. $600 stimulus checks for eligible Americans, as well as aid for small businesses and schools. The eviction moratorium is also extended. Trump was mostly on the sidelines during negotiations for this bill, but his advisors, including Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, played a big role in the negotiations.
Everybody assumed that Mnuchin was representing the White House, and that was the assumption that everybody had. And suddenly, because we have an extraordinary narcissist, pathologically narcissistic in the White House, he said, well, yes, I know there were intense negotiations, but you know what? I've now decided that I'm going to jump into the game. I want $2,000.
President Trump claims he only signed the bill after receiving reassurances from Congress that lawmakers will take up measures to give more stimulus money to Americans, a point that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has not publicly acknowledged.
I understand he wants to be remembered for advocating for big checks, for chaos and misery and erratic behavior if he allows this to expire.
And perhaps the most fascinating aspect to all of this is that in his push for $2,000 stimulus checks, President Trump got more support from Democrats than he did from Republicans. In fact, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi vowed bring the issue of $2,000 stimulus checks directly to Americans before the entire House for a vote later today. Jim.
Meanwhile, though, a lot of Americans will be waiting for that aid longer. Boris Sanchez, thanks so much. Developing this morning as well, federal authorities have now identified the man they say detonated a powerful bomb in downtown Nashville this morning. The focus now on why he did this. They've also released new surveillance video. You see a shot there now from the very moment that motorhome blew up. The blast injured 3 people. It damaged dozens of buildings, knocked out AT&T service in the area. CNN's Natasha Chen, she's live with more details. I mean, listen, the remarkable headline here, right? A suspected U.S. suicide bomber on U.S. soil.
That's right, Jim. Anthony Quinn Warner was named as the suspect yesterday by investigators. And just the day before, we spent hours watching federal agents his home collecting evidence. Now, this was processed relatively fast in identifying him. They found enough fragments of that RV in the explosion to have a vehicle identification number leading to the owner. They also found human tissue at the blast site, and they had Quantico process that DNA very quickly, along with DNA from family members. Now, late last night, as you mentioned, police released this new video of the explosion, this orange glow in that harrowing moment. That's exactly how the responding officers described that to us. The type of explosives used, still under investigation, but now those businesses are in ruins. That includes a tattoo parlor owned by Pete Gibson. Told me that he had actually seen that very RV in the previous weeks.
I pulled up in my car, and it was parked in the spot that I always park in, which is right in front of the shop. And I was really upset about that, just for no reason, I was just kind of salty someone was in my spot. I don't know what to make of it. After all this, it's just, I wish I could have done something sooner. I wish I could have known sooner, but who would have ever known?
Warner was not on law enforcement radar before this incident. Now they're looking into his history. They don't believe there are other suspects in this case. Government has asked for federal aid related to this disaster, but we have not heard yet from President Trump on that. Allison?
Natasha, thank you very much for all of that reporting. We will cover this throughout the program. Meanwhile, more than 1 million people traveled through U.S. airports on Saturday. It was one of the busiest days for air travel since the pandemic began. So what will this mean for COVID cases? CNN's Adrienne Broadus is live at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport with more. How's it looking?
Hey there, Allison. Somewhat busy this morning, a steady stream of folks behind me. And that is the big question. What will this recent travel mean? The holidays looked a lot different for some families, but for families, they continued their similar traditions, flying for the holidays. TSA data shows nearly 7 million people passed through security checkpoints over the last week. And those numbers are concerning. Here's why. Right now, the U.S. has the most coronavirus cases in the world so far, topping nearly 18 million cases over the weekend. And top doctors warn we could see some of the darkest days ahead. Here's what Dr. Anthony Fauci had to say.
We very well might see a post-seasonal, in the sense of Christmas, New Year's surge. Described it as a surge upon a surge, because if you look at the slope, the incline of cases that we've experienced as we've gone into the late fall and soon to be early winter, it is really quite troubling.
And something else that is troubling for doctors, these coming out in December, another record-breaking month. For example, more than 64,000 people died because of the coronavirus in December. And in December alone, there were 5.5 million cases. Meanwhile, data shows nearly 2 million Americans have already received the first dose of the vaccine. Indeed, that offers a little bit of hope, but the U.S. will likely fall short of that goal to inoculate 20 million people by the end of the year. Allison?
Okay, Adrienne, thank you very much. So last night, President Trump finally signed the bill for coronavirus relief, but his signature comes very late. Comes with some demands. That's next. President Trump finally signing a coronavirus relief and government funding bill into law, thereby averting a government shutdown. But the president's 11th hour demand for larger $2,000 checks is not going away. Joining us now, CNN political analyst Tolu Olorunnipa. He's a White House reporter for The Washington Post. Also with us, CNN political analyst Margaret Tlaib. She's a politics and White House editor for Axios. Great to see you guys. Margaret, I don't understand what happened. I don't understand what the president did. Had he signed it by midnight on Saturday, no benefits would have lapsed. But by waiting 12 more hours, whatever, till 7 p.m. last night, 12 million people are left in the lurch this week. Their benefits will be retroactive, but this week or next week, whenever their check doesn't show up because it was signed late, they won't be able to pay for groceries. Why did we do this?
Yeah, Allison, that's right. And many Republicans this morning are also scratching their heads, asking themselves precisely the same thing. The ultimate outcome of this is no different than if the president had just signed this on time, except for the fact that people who Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, told you'll be getting your $600 this week. That's probably not going to happen this week. And that first expanded $300 is now, in a best case scenario, pushed back by a week if you get it retroactively on the back end. So what my colleague Mike Allen's reporting says it very well. This was sort of like a hostage negotiation in the final day or so, where you had this public campaign for Republicans as well as Democrats telling the president, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. There was also a private campaign behind the scenes. And this is one that involves Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader. It involves Mnuchin. It involves Senator Lindsey Graham. This involves Republicans talking to President Trump off camera, behind the scenes, saying, look, this is a win. You want to be on the winning side. You don't want to be on the losing side. And sort of convincing President Trump, cajoling President Trump to actually go ahead and sign it because it was negotiated by his party as well as the Democrats, because this was the best scenario he was going to get at the time being, and because to delay it further would actively hurt the people who he is messaging that he's trying to help.
Listen, for so many millions of tens of millions of Americans who don't have a few $100s to tide them over crises like this makes a real difference. And Tolu, as so often happens, I mean, ego massage was a factor here. Those advocates like Lindsey Graham had to convince him what a difference he made to this stimulus deal. But part of the message is that this $600 down payment, in effect, that this benefit would be a down payment on the way to the $2,000 that the president said he desires. Is that actually true, though, right? Because Republicans, I mean, Democrats may support that, but Republicans aren't on board.
Yeah, if you look at the statements coming from the leadership in the Republican Party, including Mitch McConnell, they are not getting on board with this idea that this was all a great thing the president did in order to get people $2,000 checks. Mitch McConnell said he was happy that the president signed this bill, that it would deliver much needed relief to the American people. He did not sign on to the idea that he's going to bring up a vote and he's going to support and whip votes for $2,000 checks for the American people. Republicans have been resistant to that level of stimulus, that amount of money going to the American people. And President Trump had an opportunity early in the negotiations to try to get people to talk about that, to try to get his Republican allies to get on board with larger checks. He did not do so. He waited until the last minute. And as Margaret said, this is sort of like a hostage negotiation where President Trump is both the kidnapper and he wants to be the hero who comes in and saves the hostage at the end. It doesn't quite work that way in Congress, and I think there are a lot of Republican senators who are unhappy with the way the president handled himself, and they are not likely to go out on a limb and change their votes and change their opinion about these $2,000 checks to appease him after he did not acknowledge them and he did not work with them during the actual debate.
It's such a great point. I mean, it's the arsonist putting out the fire. And just to recap, for people who might have missed this yesterday, Republicans were speaking out about this and about, I mean, I was struck by Senator Pat Toomey. I mean, he spoke in, very colorful, clear language about what he thought was happening here. So let me just play that to recap for 1 second.
I understand he wants to be remembered for advocating for big checks, but The danger is he'll be remembered for chaos and misery and erratic behavior if he allows this to expire.
Fine. If you want to make it $2,000 checks, negotiate that from the beginning. Let's have the discussion after this bill is signed, because right now we're at a point where people are left out in the dark. But to play this old switcheroo game, which is just kind of like, I don't get the point, I don't understand what's being done, why? Unless it's just to create chaos and show power and be upset because you lost the election. Otherwise, I don't understand it.
So that, Margaret, is what was happening publicly. I mean, they were just saying Captain Chaos, basically is at it again. Those were Republicans, obviously. And so now, next up, the National Defense Authorization Act that he vetoed. And do we think that Republicans are going to override that veto?
I do. Let's put it another way. If that doesn't happen, we're in wave 3 of real trouble because there are major implications for U.S. national security. Again, all of the things that the president says that he is a proponent of. And a delay would be very impactful. But I think the Republicans at this point are showing their cards and their kind of patience running out with, this being the end game for the president in the waning days. So we will see what happens. But I think at this point that this override is on track and is going to proceed. I understand that, it relies on Democrats and Republicans all behaving according to script, but I think that script is going to hold at this point. But we'll wait and see.
I mean, the NDA it's a guns and butter issue, right? Because it's not just weapons. I mean, it's pay raises for U.S. troops. I mean, political implications of that.
Space Force.
Space Force, our favorite new force. Allison played comments from Republicans publicly criticizing the president, but this happened this Monday morning as well. And this is a notable moment. I want to show the cover of the New York Post this morning. The Rupert Murdoch-owned New York Post. They've been behind this president through thick and thin. Headline this morning, "Stop the Insanity, Mr. President." Tolu, tell me the significance of that, given how much in lockstep the Post has been with this president, given the backing for it from Murdoch. Is this a message the president listens to?
Well, it is quite significant, in part because what we have been seeing over the past several weeks is a president throwing a tantrum because he lost the election. It's important to say that just clearly. That's why he's vetoing the NDAA. That's why he held the stimulus bill and government funding bill up as a hostage for the past several days. He's upset because he lost the election. He's upset because Republicans are not standing with him. And now you have the New York Post essentially saying, Mr. President, it's time to end this ongoing tantrum. You lost the election. You need to put the country first in these final weeks of your presidency and stop trying to pretend like you are this victim who's aggrieved and who can take your power to turn them against the country. So I think the New York Post is starting to break from the president in a major way, in part because this tantrum is really grating on the country in many ways. It's making it hard for Americans who are suffering with all kinds of real problems, from their pocketbooks to their health care. Then the president is on the golf course and sort of just pouting over the fact that he lost to Joe Biden. And it's very clear that he's losing allies left and right, and the New York Post is the most recent one of those.
I think it's worth reading some of their florid language that they use, Margaret, because it is really striking. Here's one passage. Mr. President, it's time to end this dark charade. If you insist on spending your final days in office threatening to burn it all down, that will be how you are remembered, not as a revolutionary, but as the anarchist holding the match. I mean, they go on. Democrats will try to write you off as a one-term aberration, and frankly, you're helping them do it. The King Lear of Mar-a-Lago, ranting about the corruption of the world. I mean, this is a striking moment.
It's eye-popping critique, and I'll say two things. One is that there is a concern among Republicans that if he tries to burn the House down, it's not just going to cement his legacy, but the legacy of Republicans who attach themselves to him and have kind of spent the first 3.5 years largely accommodating the tactics that he wanted to employ. So I think there's some spillover concerns inside the party or the current state of the Republican Party. But the other is like, look, this elephant in the room that we all know is out there, which is that there are 20-some days until the inauguration, and Republicans as well as Democrats are very concerned about how the president is going to play this in the final days, what else he is going to do, how it's going to impact those two elections in Georgia. And so there's a real effort, both publicly through criticism and privately through more of ego management or relationship management, to try to urge the president to just be the president for his final couple of weeks, and not the theatrics and the campaign trail machinations and the power plays, but just to preside and steer the country for a few more weeks and then pass the torch to the next president. And it sounds so simple because that's the way it's been done for generations in both parties. But I think there's a wide recognition that just because that's the way it's supposed to be done, you can't count on that happening.
Well, given the last 4 years, that sounds like something like a pie in the sky hope. Let's be honest here, but
There's
anyway.
still 23 days.
Yeah, fair enough.
Margaret Toulouse, thank you both very much. There are some new developments to tell you about in the suicide bombing in Nashville, what we know about the suspect, and clues about why he did it. Next.
A bomb detonated in downtown Nashville on Christmas morning. 3 people were injured in the blast. Dozens of buildings were damaged. Amazing the human toll wasn't higher. Authorities have now identified the suicide bomber. That's right, an American suicide bomber. But the motivation, that remains a mystery. Joining us now, CNN national security analyst Julia Kayyem and CNN law enforcement analyst Jonathan Wackrow. Good to have you both on this morning. Juliet, given your history at the Department of Homeland Security, just the headline here. This is America 2020, a U.S. national, a suicide bomber, apparent suicide bomber on U.S. soil. Tell us the significance of that.
Rare, odd, indescribable at this stage in terms of what his motivation is, but let's not put flowers and roses around it. A very violent person, whatever his motivation was, did a lot of damage to an American city. And so we may try to understand him or get his motivation. That's, in some ways, we just cannot forget the violence that he engineered. And so what's happening now, I'll tell you the good news. It's not simply that few people died because of the announcements and because of the great work of the police. It is also that the U.S. attorney and the other officials that came out yesterday afternoon were very clear that they did not think that there was, or they were very clear, not even think, that there was no continuing threat. That means that their investigation is focused solely on what was he thinking, what was he reading, and what was happening to him personally. We still don't know if this was a ideological motivation or a personal motivation, and that's where the investigation turns to now.
Jonathan, obviously the term suicide bombing carries the connotation of terrorism, but if this is just a suicidal, depressed person, then are we using the right terminology?
Well, listen, suicide deaths involving explosives unconnected to terrorism is extremely rare. And in my opinion, this case is a suicide by bombing, which should be considered a staged performance. And the fact that the individual created this really dramatic event in their suicidal act. Once they decided to take their own life, this individual went ahead and arranged this act specifically. To Julia's point, the motivation is still unclear. Why did this individual create such a structure around taking their own life, and in turn putting others at jeopardy? The motivations typically for suicide can, it's a spectrum. It can go from severe depression to psychosis to a philosophical desire to die. And that's where I think this individual was on that spectrum. The decision to take their own life was predicated upon the fact that they had this structure building, with a recording, the bomb, the placement of the vehicle, the day, the time. All of this leads to furtherance of my theory that this was a staged performance in the suicidal act.
Listen, sadly, tens of thousands of Americans commit suicide every year. But right. The size of this bomb, the preparations, the giving up of property before, I mean, this was premeditated. I'm curious, Juliet, This was an enormous explosion, right? I mean,
Yes.
to gather materials for a sophisticated device like this, I mean, I know that law enforcement looks out for this kind of stuff. In New York, if you buy acetone in a hardware store, right, I mean, there are alarm bells that go off because they're looking for people that are putting this kind of stuff together. To build a sophisticated device like this and light it off in a major U.S. city, were there alarm bells missed here?
Yes, I mean, our understanding is that there was the authorities had no clue about him before this, and that's my big question: is all of the surveillance, all of the monitoring that we do in terms of the capacity of someone to be able to get these kinds of explosives, what alarms did not go off? Look, suicide is generally a private affair. I mean, and so just picking up on what Jonathan said, this is not fitting anything we know of so far, because not only was it a suicide, a performance suicide, he clearly did not want people watching. So this is not someone jumping off a bridge and holding up traffic. This is something just different. And so that's where the investigation is going to head. But the evidentiary question I have is, how did someone not sort of set off alarm bells given the magnitude of the explosives that were purchased and any other behavior? From what we know so far, this guy did not ring any, no one was paying attention to him for long periods of time. We barely have a picture.
And so what police tell us, Jonathan, is that his name is Anthony Quinn Warner, 63 years old, but he died, obviously, in the bombing. And so how will investigators figure out his motive?
Well, listen, that's the challenge in any type of explosive investigation is that you lose a lot of items potentially that could have some evidentiary value. So they have to open up the aperture in their investigation to look at literally everything about this individual. We're already hearing from some of his neighbors, some of their statements, but the law enforcement officials on the ground are going to do detailed interviews with every single neighbor to actually establish a pattern of behavior of this individual. They're also going to look at the digital forensics. They're going to look at everything that this individual touched, whether it's online, telephone records, again, to try to understand what was the motivation and how did he actually garner the knowledge to construct such a device. I mean, to your point, Jim, in New York City, you start compiling components for a bomb, law enforcement officials are immediately alerted and they react to it. What they need to look for is, what were the missed signals here? What were the red flags that persisted along the continuum to this event that were potentially missed, and how do we not let that happen again?
Well, listen, the other note here, the president completely silent on this days after this attack. Notable in his silence. We'll be listening to the president-elect Biden. He's going to be speaking later today. Look for his comments as well. Jonathan, Juliet, thanks so much to both of you. Other story we're following this morning, Dr. Anthony Fauci warning of another surge in new coronavirus infections as millions of Americans travel for the holidays, even with vaccines on the way, and that is good news.